Hello and welcome everyone to another installment of Qualifie, our student-led training and learning initiative where we are trying to connect researchers and faculty members interested in all forms of qualitative and fieldwork research. Just to let you know, we are recording this meeting and we'll be uploading it to YouTube. So should you not wish to be recorded, please switch off your camera and communicate with us via a chat function. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping announcements. Next week, on the Friday, on the 16th of April, we have our first paper presentation session in which Wolfgang Minati will be presenting his paper on ethical obligations of field research, the fallacy of vulnerability for fieldwork in violent contexts. All interested are welcome. And as usual, we also remind you that if you have a paper you'd like to present and discuss, get feedback on, please give me or Wolfgang a shout. Next, our next session of Qualifie will be on the 7th of May, and this one is especially for all of you political scientists there, because we'll be discussing the uses of focus groups in political science research. And to help us with that, we'll be joined by Dr. Liam Stanley from Sheffield University in the UK. For more info and reading list, please visit our website. And lastly, but very importantly, next month we'll be starting our Ethnography book club. And the idea is to meet roughly once a month for a casual evening of discussions about particular ethnography books. And in May, we'll start with an ethnography of Palestinian refugee camps and the importance of ordinary in the process of political self-fashioning. The book is by Dr. Luigi Achilli, who is also the Marie Curie Fellow at the Roman Schumann Center at the EY. And please do send me an email if you're interested and like to know more about the initiative. But today's session is on the notion of rapport when conducting fieldwork research, and we are very happy to be joined by Professor Gordon Mathews from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Gordon Mathews is a professor of anthropology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he teaches subjects related to culture and national identity, meaning of life, and law and globalization. Professor Mathews has an extensive experience in conducting ethnographic research in Japan, USA, Hong Kong, and China. He has published many books and articles, among which are the Ghetto at the Center of the World, Chungking Mansions, Hong Kong, and more recently, World in Guangzhou, in which he investigates African traders' networks in Southwest China. His most recent academic interests concentrate on the meaning of life after death. And Professor Mathews will give a short presentation based on his own experience and of building and maintaining rapport in the field, after which we'll open the floor for questions and discussions. So I think without any further ado, Gordon, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm glad I made it here on time. I'm glad I read your email, Mathews, because if I'd been an hour late, it would have been rather more difficult to try to run the class, I can see. But in any case, I'm going to talk pretty briefly and pretty informally about rapport in the field, and mostly, you know, it's up to you for questions. Of course, I'll be happy to talk about absolutely anything. I noticed from the notes that Mathews sent me that there's a statement about planning rapport. And what I would say is you cannot plan rapport. You can't plan this at all. You know, can you plan to have friends? Of course you can't. So it's not something you can think about. It's just something that you need to work to develop as much as possible. That's all you can do. And how do you do this? Well, the single biggest sin that anthropologists commit, and I suppose any social scientist, is not to put the time in. Journalists are even worse at this, and I'm so sick and tired of bullshitting journalists who like to come into a place like Chungking Mansions and hang out for 3 hours and then write an article as if they understand it. No, they don't. And I consistently tell them, you know, I'm not going to say anything to you until you've been here for a minimum of 3 days and hopefully 3 weeks. You need the time. And that's true for anthropology students too, and social science students in general. You got to put in the time. Over and over again in my own life, I've had a graduate student hang out in a place and they come back in and complain and say, I just can't do this. Nobody will talk to me. Go there again, hang out, hang out. If you're there long enough, people will indeed talk. They do. You know, and again, sometimes people talk about how objective are you supposed to be and so on. I'm pretty simple about this. I don't make much of a distinction between informants and friends, really. I mean, it's people, can you be objective? Well, yeah, if my friend does something stupid, if my friend, for example, is having an affair outside her marriage, or my friend is, drinking too much, of course I'm going to say something. I can be objective with friends. And the same thing is true with my informants. There's a power imbalance, absolutely, as we'll talk about in a second. I certainly don't mean to be denying that. There's also the positionality of my gender and so on, which is absolutely real, as well as my race. But nonetheless, these are basic human relations that you don't put on a separate pedestal just because they're professional. No. By the way, you read about Chungking Mansions. I still go to Chungking Mansions all the time. And I still see the people I've known, and they are people who have indeed been friends beyond research. And that's important to be able to continue this. Now, Chungking Mansions, as I think you've read about, was particularly easy for me as an older white male. Several of you here, I have to admit, would have a harder time, by your gender. Susanna or Lydia or Lillian, people would have said, what's your phone number? Are you sure you're only here for the sake of research? Isn't there something else that you'd like from me? That's what you're going to get. This is the nature of Chungking Mansions. And it's unfortunate. There are also many, many areas you can research that I can't, certainly in terms of gender, but there's absolutely no denying this. And you read about in my chapter, I think, how some of the women who really deeply sought to do research in Chungking Mansions had a tough time because of the gender barrier that particularly Muslim men, as well as some Nigerian men who felt that these women were obvious desirable partners, they had much more difficulty than I ever did. Also, as you know from what I wrote, as a white man, it was really easy for me in Chungking Mansions. If I'd been Indian or Pakistani, they would have thought this guy's a business competitor. He's trying to get information and start his own phone stall. If I were Chinese, they would have thought I must be an undercover cop. Now, they might have thought you're getting kind of old to be an undercover cop, but still, that's probably what they would have thought. As it is, the worst accusation I was given was of being a CIA agent. But on the other hand, I'd say, look, if I was CIA, do you think I'd be here? Do you think I'd care that you're selling, $5,000 worth of copy mobile phones? Of course, I'd not. Of course not. I have better things to do. I'd be off in the stock exchange or something. I'd be off doing things with people more important than either of us are here. And mostly they tended to believe this. Always the big problem in field work is one of, when you first walk in there, are people going to pay attention to you? Are they just going to tell you to go away? And I had those fears too. Everybody does. You walk into a strange place and, you say, hi, how are you? Fuck you. Get out of here. That's the nightmare that you face. Is anybody going to be willing to talk to you at all? But in Chungking Mansions, it didn't really happen. People are quite happy to talk, at first because they thought I was a customer. And they're, hey, come to my restaurant, come to my guest house. After a while, it was more just because I was there and hanging out. I occasionally had difficult moments. You read a little bit about these. The fact that I'm diabetic and had an insulin reaction once, and an ambulance came and picked me up, it led a number of the Muslims to think that I was drunk. And if I was drunk, I'd lost all credibility as an anthropologist to them. There was also the even more potentially dangerous, actually, but more amusing situation when that BBC reporter came to talk to me and had a very plunging neckline and short skirt. And in Chungking Mansions in a Muslim environment, you really better not do that. She left after an hour, and then, as I think you read about, I went up to my room, the guest house I was staying in, and about midnight, there was this loud knocking on the door. And it turned out to be 8 Pakistani guys with big cricket bats, because they were convinced that I was only going to Chungking Mansions, not as an anthropologist, but because I wanted to sleep with women. And they were convinced that this was clearly abusing Chungking Mansions. And as a result, they were going to beat me up and teach me a lesson. And I'll never forget, opening the door, and they just peeked in. They were convinced I must be there with this BBC reporter. Of course I wasn't. Of course I'm alone. And they saw that and were very embarrassed. We're just checking this room to see if maybe it'll be vacant tomorrow. Bye. And then later I talked to these guys, a number of them, and they were rather apologetic. They had been misinformed about why I was there. But all these are things that happen. And I feel happy that I came to be accepted pretty well. I mean, I remember people telling me things about all the copies they're selling and all the bad things they're doing, working illegally and so on. And I said, why are you telling me this stuff? And they said, I'm not afraid of what you might say. You're a professor. We know that, which was rather nice to get that. Now, this too was naive on their part. I could have been an undercover cop who happened to have a name card saying I was a professor, but they chose to believe it, and I'm happy that they did. One matter I said before is I do consider these people to be my friends. And I've actually been told that. A head of the security in Chungking Mansions took me aside one day and said, Gordon, you know, your big problem is you only see the good side of people. And that's fine, but you can't ever work in security because you only see that good side. I did that. Somebody may be dealing heroin off to the side, but I don't particularly want to know, except unless it relates to my researches. And a couple times it did, mostly it doesn't. It's also true that when you do field work like what I did, it's important to remember that not everyone needs to like you. You know, if you're in a building of 2,000 people, you're only going to have maybe 50 or 100 people who really want to talk to you at length. That's fine. 100 people will tell you all you need to know. Now, you don't want to make enemies of the other people, but you're not going to get to know everyone. Some kinds of research are more difficult. I mean, if you're looking at, in a small city, at transsexual sex workers, for example, or evangelical Christians in a very secular place, or right-wing extremist groups, it may be really important that everybody in a given group likes you. You can't afford to lose an informant. But in a place like Chungking Mansions, no. I didn't have any enemies, I don't think, but some people, you know, I'd like to talk to and still do, and some didn't. Now, let me briefly make a comment here on how I wrote the book, because this may be useful to you. Everything I did involved a little recorder, and I did not use my mobile phone. I had a Sony recorder expressly devoted to recording. There are two ways this was used. One way is when I'm talking to somebody, I would say, can I record you? Often they would say yes. And if they said yes, great. I want a record of it. I would tell them I'm not going to give away your name at all. You know, as soon as I transcribe this, I'm going to disguise your name. I'm going to throw this recording away. But, you know, I wanted to get their words. If I couldn't do that, then what I did was talk to them. And then as soon as I could, slip away somewhere and record on my own. And I needed to do this quickly because otherwise I would forget. Pretty soon, people in Chungking Mansions became used to the fact that I would slip off in a hallway somewhere and be recorded. You know, they found it amusing rather than anything else, which I appreciate. But the important thing is, don't wait. You got to do this right away. Now, in writing the book, it was extremely easy because all I basically did was take all my transcribed notes. I had, I don't remember, maybe 400, 500 pages of single-space notes. So what I did was quickly design, okay, here are 5 chapters I'm going to have. What are the, how do these fit in different chapters? Do a lot of cutting and pasting. Spend 3 months cutting and pasting from my notes. Once I did that, the book wrote itself. It wrote itself in about 6 months' time. It's extremely easy when you have those notes. And the book is basically the notes put together with a little bit of analysis added. That's what happened here. Okay, the final topic I want to talk about here is a bit more morally difficult here. And it's something that I've thought about a lot and given a lot of talks about. I was last in Europe before COVID-19, in Trento, actually. By the way, where are you guys now?
Florence.
Florence, okay. You weren't all that far from Trento then. I see, no wonder I got the time zone mixed up. I see, but anyway.
Trento, you mean the summer school in ethnography?
Yeah, I did the summer school in ethnography.
I was looking at it.
That was a lot of fun there, and I talked specifically about the moral issues of Chungking Mansions. They published what I wrote. You can see that if you want, but let me briefly talk about this here. Power. Obviously, I have far more power than the people I'm studying, number one. Not everybody, because some of the people in Chungking Mansions have a lot of money, but many don't, the majority don't, the great majority don't, and I have more power than they do. Number two, who benefits from the book? I do. They don't. You know, this is helping me. And I am using their stories and being sympathetic in writing their stories. And I certainly hope you saw that in what I wrote, but I'm benefiting me. It's helped my career. I got to go to Trento. I got to talk to you guys. They didn't. And so this is an inherent unfairness built in. Do I provide benefits? Yeah, I provide a lot. I've given away huge amounts of money over the years. I still teach a class of asylum seekers in Chungking Mansions. You know, I began my research 15 years ago, and I'm still teaching them now. Just today, I gave some guy US $600 so that he managed to get his visa to get into Indonesia. He's going to be an English teacher there. Well, of course I'm going to help him out. Of course I'm going to pay, and I do this all the time. I've given, how much money have I given out? I mean, it must be something approaching US $100,000 over the years. It's not a tiny amount when I add up everything. Fine, I am excessively well paid. That's perfectly okay with me. But it also leads to this curious matter of I am playing God, because I don't say yes to everybody. Somebody comes up to me and says, I really need money. Do I give them money? Most often I do. But for example, I remember an asylum seeker during the time I was doing research in Chungking Mansions saying, I really need to borrow 500 Hong Kong dollars, about US $80. And I said, why? Well, I met this girl and you know, I'm going out on a date with her tonight, and I don't want her to know I'm an asylum seeker, so I've got to pay for our date. Look, she's going to find out you're an asylum seeker sooner or later. Why should I pay for your date now? And I didn't give him money, but then later this had what might have been a tragic outcome, because he asked me 2 weeks later for money so that he could buy a SIM card to call home instead of using a landline. He is an African asylum seeker from a Central African country. And I said, look, use the landline, because I didn't believe him after that earlier episode. I mean, I thought I didn't fully trust him. So I gave him some money to use a landline, but not enough to dial home with a SIM card. And I later found out with some corroboration that the police had traced the call that he had made. They were after his sister. His brother had stopped them at the door, and his brother had been shot dead by police. Now, I don't know if that's true. I think it probably is. And if so, that's on my head. On the other hand, I mean, I can't pay for everyone. I've got to make these judgments. I'm not God. I've also spent a lot of money to bring at least a dozen different asylum seekers in Hong Kong too, living in the West. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time visiting and just communicating with asylum seekers I've known in places like Nevada in the US, Oregon in the US, Vancouver, Toronto, one guy driving a truck across the US, another guy in Birmingham in England, a bunch more all over the place. So I've done a lot to help, but still, you know, these judgments get made, and I don't like this. I'm unhappy being in this situation, but what else can I do? There are so many people need money that if I gave money to everybody I knew, with all that they possibly need, I would have nothing left. So it's a difficult problem. Do I feel guilty? I feel guilty about the one incident I described to you, although there wasn't a whole lot I could have done about it, tracing back on it. I thought about that a lot. I am blessed in the fact that my role in Chungking Mansions appears to be really positive to almost everybody there. I mean, I've never had anybody get angry at me in Chungking Mansions. Instead, I mean, I'm greeted there by a lot of people I've known for a long time. And I'm really happy that that's the case. Chungking Mansions continues to be more my home than my own department is in some senses. So it's interesting. That's not true for everywhere I've researched. Guangzhou, where my last book was about, I haven't been able to go back because of COVID-19, and I don't know most people there now. So this isn't simply because I'm a nice person. A lot of it is Chungking Mansions is near here. I can go back and visit it. But the point is that in the overall reception of my book, I've been extremely lucky. I could have really messed up Chungking Mansions. Let me give you one example. The one bit of friction I got at first in my writing about Chungking Mansions was from some asylum seekers who said things to me like, you said that many of us work illegally. You should never have said that. Well, I said that because I'm assuming every policeman in Hong Kong knows this. And I think I was right. Later, I found out that in LegCo, in the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, they were debating Chungking Mansions and asylum seekers, and somebody cited an appearance I did on CNN to say, let's give asylum seekers more money. And so they raised their monthly stipend by Hong Kong $500, US $80. Not a lot, but great. I was lucky that happened. They didn't go in the other direction. Many of these guys are cheating. Let's just block them entirely. They're all fakes. They could have said that, but they didn't. By the same token, you know, all kinds of bad things could have happened. It could have been that the merchants in Chungking Mansions decided to open really high-end guest houses because my book was bringing in more tourists. By the way, not the English language book, but the mainland Chinese version of the book has sold, you know, 40,000 or so copies. So a lot of tourists have come in from that book. I think the book in English hasn't had that much of an effect, but the Chinese version has. And that's led to a lot more tourists coming in. They could have all upgraded their guest houses. That could have made prices in general untenable for the South Asians and asylum seekers from Africa and other places in the building. That could have ended Chungking Mansions. It could have become one more second or third rate Chinese mall. That didn't happen. Again, I was very lucky because there's always the law of unintended consequences. You never know what the effect of what you do is going to be. And, you know, I admit that for several weeks, I wondered, should I publish this book or not? And I decided to. Now, later books, I've decided not to publish before I've written them, fortunately. I was writing and planning to write a book about asylum seekers in Hong Kong. And the director of an NGO took me aside and said, you really shouldn't write this book for another 10 years. It's just too dangerous now. I think he's right. So I've abandoned that. I'm not going to do it. So it's not that I would do anything, but in this case, my guess is that it would be more positive than negative in its effects. And I think it has been. I have been lucky, very lucky. Okay, that's my shtick here. I hope you have various questions for me. Jump in.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Yes, indeed. We're gonna open the floor now to anyone. Please, I guess just raise your hand and I will, if you don't want to be recorded or your connection is unstable, write in the chat, but otherwise you can just raise your hand or just jump in.
While you're thinking, I'm gonna get myself some tea. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I think Susanna was the first one.
Thanks, and thanks for this presentation. I really enjoyed reading the text that Mathews passed on to us, and to hear a bit more from you about your experience of doing this research. My question kind of relates to what you were just talking about, actually, about the decision to publish this. And I was wondering, before you wrote the book, kind of what you had in mind in terms of the audience that would be reading it, because I don't come from a kind of background of ethnography, and I'm very much in the sphere of political science, where I'm imagining writing for a purely academic audience. But I can see that with this type of text, it has the potential to have a much broader appeal. So I was wondering kind of to what extent you were already thinking about this before you started writing.
Yeah, and that's an important question. I'm glad you asked that, Susanna. I have always been myself unwilling to be too constrained by academia. Now, what discipline are you from, Susanna?
So since this year, I would say political science.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, political science is a somewhat more specialized discipline in various ways. And, people write professional articles for one another. And the impact of political scientists often goes beyond their academic department in terms of advising politicians and so on. That's a whole different route. Anthropology is a different matter because mostly we're politically irrelevant, and not always, but mostly. And so as a result, how is it that you have an influence beyond your own immediate academic world? And I think you do it by writing for a larger audience. Now, it's also true that when I read anthropology, I realize that many anthropological writers of the past, Ruth Benedict and so on, or Marvin Harris, wrote for a popular audience. But anthropology has become increasingly specialized and narrow, of people only writing for one another. And that's a real loss. As I wrote about in my last book in Guangzhou, in one of the first pages, I have this example that I love to talk about, how, if I'm a heart surgeon and I write, if a heart surgeon writes an article that I can make no sense of, it doesn't matter. If the heart surgeon operates on me and cures my heart problem, great, he saved my life. If an architect writes an article that makes no sense to me, it doesn't matter if the architect builds a building that's really beautiful and that really suits what I'm looking for. But an anthropologist, if they don't write so that people can understand them, what use are they? And I think that's a real question for this particular discipline. Now, fortunately, since I wrote this, there have been a lot of efforts for anthropology to become more open. Somebody like Thomas Hyland Erickson, for example, who's written a lot of books, is an eminently clear writer. A journal like Sapiens is eminently clear. The Chungking Mansions book didn't get me in any trouble for that. I thought it would. I thought I would be criticized more, and I know some of my earlier books have been, but the Chungking Mansions book, I loved one review, which came out, I think, in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Society, which said, the theory is all here, but it's very subtle. Oh man, what a nice, sweet thing for that person to have said. I really appreciate that. Not, it's atheoretical, he doesn't know anything, but the theory is here, but it's so subtle, you've got to read carefully. Man, I feel grateful to that. So I don't think I've suffered professionally from writing this way. And I've tried to do this all my career, but I think it's been a benefit. And I tell my PhD students this too, always, write clearly. If I don't understand what you're talking about, there's a problem here. And often graduate students in particular start off by taking on this new language, trying to assume this new identity that causes them to write stuff that's inexplicable. And that's kind of a problem. There's an often oft-told story that I think is true, probably in political science as well as anthropology, that graduate students and assistant professors are incapable of writing ordinary language. But by the time they become associate professors or professors, it's a lot easier. They've gone back. They don't have to assume this professional identity because they've got it now and they can write for ordinary people. I've always written more or less for ordinary people, although it depends the audience I'm writing for, obviously. But that's been my own aim. I'm trying to reach a larger audience. Now, much of the time I fail. I've certainly written books that I thought should be read by a large audience. And, I might have 1,000 readers and no more than that. That can certainly happen. Chungking Mansions, I think, was the exception rather than the rule in much of my career. But nonetheless, that's my own personal effort. Being from political science, you might want to make a rather different effort, and that's perfectly fine. If you were an anthropologist, I guess I would stress that at least in some contexts, and maybe after you become a tenured professor, with a job security, then write for an audience beyond your own specialty alone and your own professional group alone. Yeah.
Cool. Wolfgang and then Lydia. Lydia, do you want to go? Wolfgang first and then Lydia.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Gordon, for the great presentation. I'd also very much like to read the book. I have several questions. I might start with one because big part of what you describe about the mansion, after all, is about all this illegal activity. And I was just wondering how you how that affected your rapport with those people. How did you? You kind of briefly touched upon it that you don't care, but do you then just gloss over it? Are you you compared it with talking about friends, so are you actually talking about it? Are you hiding it? So how did that kind of play a role in talking with these people, or with some of these people?
That's an interesting point, Wolfgang. And there's some illegal activity that I would definitely not condone, and I might even go to police. Violence, for example, would be one. I don't want to be involved in that. Dealing heroin, I never knew of anybody dealing heroin in a sustained way who was my friend. In that case, I might simply have criticized them harshly because I don't want to act in any more of a punitive way than that. But you know, that would be something that really would not be acceptable. But the kind of illicit behavior I saw was selling copy goods for the most part, or working illegally, or sex work. And all three of those I can justify. I mean, I've actually got a piece on the web about that I wrote for Sapiens, the flip side of counterfeit goods, and some other pieces I've written that counterfeit goods, copy goods are actually good. They may hurt the intellectual property holders. If it's a copy medicine, they may kill people. That's bad. But basically, it's knockoff and copy China phones that have enabled Africa and many other parts of the world to become globalized. You wouldn't have a smartphone if it weren't for a Chinese knockoff. So that's a really important feature. China's brought the world of globalization. Japan and the US certainly didn't. So in that sense, I certainly can morally justify what they were doing with no question. Working illegally, yeah, here I can justify it too, because one story that I don't think you read about yet, but you may want to, was my friend from Kolkata who was working illegally. And he flew back home because he would renew his visa every 42 days and bring stuff back to India. And I went home with him and I realized in Hong Kong, he's paid almost nothing. He was paid less than half the minimum wage. You know, he was making something like US $600 a month or $500 a month a pittance. But when I went home with him, I saw he is the conquering hero at home. He is the one who's paid for his four sisters' weddings. He is the one who's rebuilt the family house. He is the one who's got the shiny new motorcycle. And I remember walking with him in this neighborhood, and all the neighborhood kids would follow him like he was a big hero. Wow, he's done it. And I realized, you know, yeah, he's underpaid. Yeah, that's not good. But nonetheless, he is accepting these wages and he makes more money than his wife does, who is an elementary school teacher in Kolkata. So let it be. And then I talked to his employer and I gently asked, look, you're hiring him illegally. Is that okay? And he said, look, if I couldn't hire him illegally, then my store would collapse, not him, but all the asylum seekers I sell. If my store collapsed, I'd have to go on welfare. Isn't it better the government lets me hire people illegally? And the government does. I think I've described in the book, maybe it's not in the section you read, how undercover cops, everybody knows they're undercover cops. I mean, I can recognize an undercover cop from 100 yards away. A couple of times, I confess, in Chungking Mansions, I behaved rather badly. I would see an undercover cop and I'd come up to him and say, "Hi, I'm an anthropologist. You must be a policeman. Glad to meet you." That was not a very nice thing to do, but the police, interestingly, didn't get angry. They just were, okay. And I realized the police don't want to catch people. No, the police are there because mass media has said, oh, asylum seekers are working illegally. But in Chungking Mansions, Hong Kongers aren't going to work anyway. They don't want to go to that building. So working illegally, unlike in some other areas of Hong Kong, does not take away citizens' jobs. No, it just enables the building to continue and supports some of the Hong Kong Chinese owners and some of the businesses there. So it's not a bad situation. It's a win-win situation. So again, in this case, fine. I don't sense a problem with this at all. And, you know, it's funny. I remember seeing a policeman come up to an asylum seeker friend of mine and say, "You're not doing anything bad here, are you? I mean, except for working illegally. You're not doing anything bad, are you?" Meaning, if you're selling drugs, fine, we don't want that. But, you know, working illegally, fine. Now, people go to jail in Hong Kong for 2 years or more if they're caught working illegally. That's a big deal. But in Chungking Mansions, they're generally protected unless they're rather stupid and unlucky. Stupid in the sense that they do indicate that in some way that they are selling stuff. They shouldn't be doing that. One more story from Chungking Mansions, this is one of my favorites, was when 2 undercover cops came in and sat at a restaurant. And everybody knew they were undercover cops. Their hair was short. They had exactly the uniform of undercover cops. And they said, "I want a biryani," which is an Indian dish. And the waiters all just ignored them. The waiters all just scattered into the crowd around. And you could see them, I want a biryani, bring me biryani now. Nobody paid any attention to them. These poor undercover cops, 2 hours just sitting there, I want a biryani, bring me a biryani. Silence. And then eventually they just got up and left. And after that, the waiters all came back. I mean, that was sort of an emblematic situation here. There certainly are other situations where ethically it becomes highly difficult. I'm thinking of the sociologist Alice Goffman, who was in a really tough situation because her informants were involved in planning a murder, and she was widely criticized for not stopping this. And I sympathize with her, but I also sympathize with her critics. I was fortunate never, ever to have been involved in anything like that, in anything that I felt was reprehensible, even sex work. You know, the sex worker I came to know best told me very clearly, look, I am engaged in sex work in a top part of town, not around Chungking Mansions. She lived in Chungking Mansions, because I've got a son and I want to see him all the way through college. And then she was from Kenya. And then I want to open a restaurant in Nairobi, a really good restaurant. If I do this for 5 years and save up enough money, I can do these things. Great, that's the perfect dream she should have. Who could begrudge her sex work for this? Of course you couldn't do that. Fine, absolutely. Now, whether she succeeded or not, I don't know. But she had the same dream of success that, you know, capitalist entrepreneurs and workers everywhere have. So, you know, who can think anything bad about that? So I guess that's my long response to what you're saying, really, that I suppose, again, I was lucky in not having to deal with a more serious moral issue here. There were a couple of times I came up with moral issues that I saw, but I was in no position to act on them. One time that I remember vividly was seeing an Indonesian woman being raffled off to the highest bidder. She obviously had lost her job and was homeless, and she was being raffled off to anybody for sex work. She obviously didn't want to be there, but I walked into that scene and then it was over within 5 seconds, not because I'd come in, but just because the scene was over. And so I didn't know what was going on. I didn't say anything, but that would have been really bad. Other moral issues came when TV cameras and so on came in and were filming people they shouldn't have filmed. And I got rather angry at that. And if anybody wants to ask about this, I'll tell you stories about that. But the specific issue of illegality, no, that wasn't that much of an issue.
Right, Wolfgang, do you have any follow-ups? Or if not, we move on to Lydia and then Lillian. Lillian, sorry. Lydia, do you have a question?
Okay, yes, it's me. Sorry, I just get confused. No, I mean, thank you a lot for sharing your very interesting experiences. And I'm just have a bit like a curiosity or like some questions I also like currently encounter for my own like field research. Also with regard to, let's say, interaction with research participants. And also the question, okay, what is my own role as a researcher? And I mean, like I would be interested a bit, so like, for example, I encounter like some research participants who has like some, I don't know, say, okay, I'm doing like a good job. It's very important, the research I do. It's important also to, let's say, change the picture of the region we are in that is really somehow peripheral, marginalized within mainstream discourses. And then like, and also mainstream research existing. And then I'm asking myself, okay, I'm doing now my PhD. So it's just like within a PhD thesis, can I really, let's say, fulfill these expectations that research participants may have on the research I'm doing? And the second question is,
what research are you doing? What is the research?
So my focus is on North Africa. So I'm focusing on, let's say, border communities and their, let's say, perception of security, insecurity. So I'm working also a bit ethnographic, but yeah, it's more in the field of peace, conflict, research. Yes. And then the second question is a bit, so I have.
Let me answer the first question if I could, Lydia, because I'll forget the first question by the time I think about the second question. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And for you as a PhD student, it's hard because, you know, your PhD thesis will not be read by people and will probably, I mean, it might be, but it's not too likely that it will be, and probably will not have the influence that they think it will. So that's kind of a problem. Now, do you have a long-term responsibility? Yeah, you probably do, to make life better for your informants to the extent that you can, and not simply benefit yourself. But your informants, your interviewees have to understand this is long-term. You're in no position now to do that. I mean, you can't jump up and say, these people are suffering and expect to be listened to unless you get very, very lucky. But over the long term, you may well be able to. And I think the big job for anthropology is to humanize people. And I think that's what we do. I was recently reading a book by a Swedish anthropologist about Liberian and Sierra Leone child soldiers who cut people's arms off, you know, and man, it was a shocking thing to read, but in effect, he humanized them. You could see who these people are. And that's one thing that we do. Now, Lydia, there is a problem here, which is that, do you tell the truth? And that's a very big problem, because anthropologists often do want to humanize the people they write about, but you find out stuff that you don't want to know. I didn't tell everything. You know, there are some things that I did keep hidden to protect certain of the people I interviewed, and that's fine. However, I'm certainly not going to lie overall, because it seems to me I have two responsibilities. One is to my interviewees, but the second is to my audience. I've got to give a true portrayal. So that, for example, if I'd said that Chungking Mansions, nobody ever works illegally, that would have been a lie and it would have been a disservice. Of course they do. Let this be out there. So, you know, I do make a real effort to balance these in dealing with my audience and having responsibility to them, as well as the people I interview. Now, my great effort in the book as a whole is to portray a very sympathetic yet honest portrayal of these people. And that's what I think I've tried to do in all my books about many, many different topics. Be sympathetic but honest. Sometimes it doesn't work out well. One of my earlier books was actually about American Buddhists, and it was called Global Culture, Individual Identity, Searching for Home in the Cultural Supermarket. And I talked to one American Buddhist teacher who sounded very much like a jerk. And I quoted him rather intensely. I mean, I quoted him for an interview in the page, and he came up to me 2 years later and said, "You made me sound like a jerk." Well, I didn't make you sound like a jerk. You sounded like a jerk. Sorry about that. He said some things that he felt he shouldn't have said. At other times, I've had people in that book too who said things that was indiscreet, and they asked me to rescind the interview after the fact. And I said, well, no. What I will do is disguise you to such a degree that nobody will know who you are. You will be completely hidden. But you did say this in this interview, and I explained to you what it was going to be about. And so this person sort of harumphed, but it was great. I'm glad she said what she said. She was a civil servant talking about how she didn't give a damn about the Chinese flag. Of course she was sensitive about this, but that was a really important topic in the context of the book. So this is always a little difficult, and you always do it on a case-by-case basis of what you say and what you don't. Now, to give you an example from some other research I've done, I was writing about people from my first book, What Makes Life Worth Living. I was writing about them 20 years later. And one middle-aged woman told me that she was having very frequent sexual affairs outside of marriage now. I am not going to touch that. Absolutely not. I don't care how good it would, how much this would improve my narrative as it would have. Because if her husband, who doesn't read English, were ever to pick it up and use a dictionary to figure this out, or if it were to be translated into Japanese, I don't want to put that down. So I'm not saying put down everything, but you got to be rather careful of what you can do without hurting your interviewees and what really might conceivably hurt them. And the latter cannot be done. So I guess my conclusion to what you're saying, your question, Lydia, is follow the Hippocratic Oath of you don't necessarily need to benefit the people who you're writing about. It's better if you do, but not everybody needs to be benefited, but do no harm. Now, as I said about Chungking Mansions' book, I was hesitant about publishing it because you might do harm inadvertently, that can happen. But at least do your best not to do harm. Okay, Lydia, next question.
Can I,
Yes.
Jeff, are you eager to jump in?
can I just follow up? Because I mean, Gordon.
Lydia's next, but we'll do the next question first.
No, because it's directly related to just what you said. I mean, I just don't get how you can be in a position to make that decision. So you're researching a vulnerable population, right? And how do you know that, publicizing that all these people work illegally there is not going to do any harm, where you may, and that was okay, but then like the where you ended it, the person having an affair, well, you couldn't possibly write about that. I mean, I teach this stuff and I have no idea how I would advise these researchers here to navigate that and make that decision. I just, how do you do that? I mean,
Sure. And that's an excellent point. And I guess the short answer, Jeff, is I don't know myself. I mean, we're always playing this out. We don't know how things necessarily go. I guess, though, as a general rule of thumb, for individuals, whatever could cause them to be exposed in terms of their identity should not be put in. Don't let them be exposed. Now, there are multiple ways to do this. In my recent book on Guangzhou, I split one person into 3 different characters because one character was engaged in questionable activities of questionable legality. One other was as a prominent Muslim. These cannot ever be put together. And so that basic point, never allow the individual to be exposed. That's key. When it comes to those larger issues, though, of the effects of what you write, you're right. That is a tricky issue. Now, why did I choose to expose the issue of asylum seekers working? Because every policeman I knew, and I got to know a number of policemen over this, said everybody knows this. We all know this. I also checked in LegCo and realized, and I talked to one LegCo member in Hong Kong, and he said, people know this if they're paying any attention. They're aware of this. So, I mean, I did some homework here to see if it would be okay to say this. I'm not doing this blindly. But your basic point is entirely correct. The law of unintended consequences is quite terrifying. And the only way I can look at this is it better to shut up? Sometimes it is. I think for the book on asylum seekers that I was mentioning to you earlier, yeah, it probably is better to shut up and not do it. But for these other works, when I've considered them all along the process of putting them together, I felt it's better to get them out there. And thus far in my research, and I trust in my research throughout my life, which will be ending, my life won't end soon, but my professional position will. I hope my life won't end soon anyway. Jeff, the point is that my judgments have been right. Not necessarily in terms of some disgruntled individuals, but there's never anything where I can think I clearly screwed up. I can say that when it comes to individuals in terms of giving money, as my earlier example told. But in terms of publicizing or not, no. Largely because the individuals have been so well hidden. And what's happened as a group, I mean, I guess it's also true that most of my writing hasn't been about vulnerable populations, but the 2 most recent books have been. And I have worked to find out all the information I can before judging them. Now, my last book about Guangzhou was another potential danger because that was translated into Chinese, and if it had been published in the mainland, I think it gave a very sympathetic picture, but the government might have been upset. Well, it was censored at the last minute. It was fully translated, and the press had bought it and come out with the cover and everything else, but the Chinese government said, no, can't print it. So in a sense, my moral dilemma was taken out of my hands by the government. That may be true. So you can judge for yourself as a teacher, Jeff. Maybe I've just been remarkably lucky, but maybe a little bit of my foresight has helped in making these judgments. Maybe we should debate this some more because, I mean, I want to get your response before we continue back. What do you think? I mean, I know what I've said is not fully intellectually satisfactory, but I'd imagine you yourself as a professional have to make similar judgments, don't you?
Me? Yes. No, your answer is totally understandable. I just the level of local knowledge, if that's the way I can put it, you needed to have to make that ethical judgment that actually it's going to be okay to publicize this, right? A lot of us probably, even if you've been in the field and I don't know, we're not going to be in a position to have that level of knowledge, and therefore, if it was me, I would say I can't publish this, right? But I mean, ethically, that's sort of the thought process you sketched out for me. That works. The ethics committee at EUI, if we took something like this to them and said, well, this is how we're going to handle the final decision about publicizing this stuff, they probably would not buy it.
Well, ethics committees is a whole scandal.
Yeah, no. I appreciate that, but yeah, I mean, these researchers have to deal with this committee here, and
What discipline are you in, Jeff?
I'm political science, so I'm a loser.
That may, well, not a loser, but that.
Oh, we're losers.
Well, I'm not saying anything about that, but that may be a key element of difference, because anthropologists, the one thing you must have is local knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, for Chungking Mansions, I'm talking about 4 years of local knowledge, and everywhere. I mean, you really get that. That's the first thing I would tell any of my students: extensive local knowledge. So that might be one way to get around it, and I can rely on the soft judgment a little more than a political scientist, for whom you're right. The local context may be harder to get, because if you're writing an article, you wouldn't have the time and the depth of knowledge to necessarily know that.
So sorry, we should go back to Lydia. I didn't mean, I jumped in.
Sorry, let me just, Joseph, do you have a question relating to this as well? If not,
yeah,
I'll go.
I mean, it's slightly a different angle. I wanted to ask about your views on the situations when the power dynamics are slightly different, when you're essentially doing ethnography among elites, so governmental officials, lawyers in law firms, people in international organizations. How do you, first, I mean, of course, questions about access, how to get people to talk about beyond platitudes, and also how then you deal with the dilemmas as to what to disclose. Obviously, I mean, to anonymize everything, but there the situation might be, I mean, the power dynamics might be slightly different as to what to disclose about the decision-making processes, what kind of interests are taken into account when a policy is presented, as opposed to how it is justified actually in public. So if you have some thoughts on these situations.
That's an interesting topic. I first dealt with this question of they have more power than I did when I was a graduate student, because most of my initial work has been on Japan. And as a poor American graduate student going to Japan in the 1980s, when, damn, there was a lot of money around, I would have my interviewees buying me lunch and buying me dinner. Oh, you're just a poor American graduate student. Let me take care of you. So it was very funny how that tended to work out. I complained to my advisor then, I am one of the first anthropologists in the world who clearly has to do research as a beggar compared to my interviewees, which was quite interesting. Later on, it did become more serious. Interestingly, when I was interviewing a lot of American Tibetan Buddhists, because many of them were indeed quite wealthy. And I remember, for example, interviewing a surgeon, and he gave me 45 minutes. And I had all the stuff I wanted to find out, but bing, time's up, next. I mean, there's not a lot I could do. Certainly, numbers of anthropologists have written about the difficulty of studying up. Laura Nader may have advocated it, but it's hard to do, because people often don't have time. They see no reason in the world to give you time of day. I mean, Lydia was describing earlier how her interviewees, they want her to publicize what's going on. People upstairs, people higher up, they don't. Why should I talk to you? That's likely to be what you're going to hear. So that's a whole problem in its own right. Now, as an anthropologist, I generally don't talk to top officials much. That's not really required for me to do. And also, I'm not likely to get the real account. Either they don't know it or they won't tell me the truth. So for me, it was more a matter of finding a cop in Chungking Mansions, especially the commander there, and who's not that high level, and saying, look, after you get off your shift, let's go have a drink someplace and talk. And then just getting him a couple of beers and asking him if I can record him. No, I can't, but making damn sure that I remember everything he's telling me. That was the nature of dealing with power. Now, he had power, but still, it wasn't a matter of me having to reach all the way up and talk to, the president of a corporation or the president of a society, which would, yes, be much harder to do, no doubt about it. So I guess I'm saying I've only to a limited degree talked to people at a really high level of power. But when I have talked to people like that, it's been a lot harder than talking to the people who I've talked to, largely because many of the people who I talk to do have a lot of time. And so I can sit around and talk rather easily. And it's a question of, well, I have to write papers. What am I going to do? I don't have time to be here. But if they have 4 hours, I've got 4 hours too. That's the attitude I have to have. And they've been able to give me that time. So that's been one key part of it.
So we have, I don't know, Lydia, Lillian. I don't know who wants to go first. Lillian, maybe, since you've been waiting so long.
Sure. Yeah, and Gordon's responses to these questions have made me feel like the question I wanted to ask is appropriate. So my research is focused on refugee policies in Jordan, and I've done a lot of interviews at very high elite levels, and I've done interviews with very vulnerable refugees where you kind of feel like you're exploiting them in this way that I never felt like if I was interviewing a former minister. So that's just to give you a little context about my work. And I would like to hear more about your relationship with like Chinese authorities, because I'm thinking about doing research in authoritarian states and the challenges, the unique challenges that brings. And I wondered if you ever were confronted by authorities who wanted to know more about what you were doing, who are maybe concerned about what you're doing. You mentioned that this book was published in Chinese. So I'm guessing that for whatever reason, they're not finding this book threatening. But then you mentioned you had another book where they decided not to publish it, at least in mainland China. So I was just curious to hear a little bit more about your relationship with these kind of state authorities and how that might have affected your research, how it might have affected what you were willing to publish, or were there any moments where there was something you wanted to write, but you worried it might hinder your access to your research site, and you're working there, so whether it might affect your job? I was just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, that's an interesting question. Now, Lily, in Hong Kong, at least up until the last year, which is a whole other subject, has been a quite free society. Authorities didn't want to talk to me, and that still is the case. I wrote an article in 2013 for the local newspaper here, the local English language newspaper, saying the problem of asylum seekers can be fixed easily. What you need to do is give all asylum seekers who want to work a 4-year, one-time, non-renewable visa. Then the only people who stay will be those who are likely to be genuine asylum seekers. That's going to make it far easier to distinguish between who is genuine and who's not. This would solve your problem. And I never heard from the government because I'm convinced the government wanted an illegal power supply, an illegal labor supply. That's what they were looking for. And asylum seekers wanted that too. They'd rather work for 10 years and simply run the risk of jail than have a non-renewable visa. Fine. But Hong Kong authorities have never been threatening to me at all. Now, that may be different now. I wrote an article for the Hong Kong Free Press about 6 weeks ago saying that I was going to continue to teach using critical thinking, and that might it might lead me to being put in jail. I don't think it will, but it could. And I've actually been in all kinds of Hong Kong mass media lately simply because I'm saying this, which nobody else would say. Is that itself dangerous? It might be. So I may wind up in jail in Hong Kong. I don't think so. I've estimated to my department maybe a 15 to 20% chance. So it's relatively small. I think Hong Kong will stay free except for stifling democracy, but I don't know, and I might be running the risk. I did have an NGO contact me and saying, look, before you go to jail, if you do go to jail, make this list of the books you want to read, and we'll check and see if they're in the jail library so that you can read them, so that when you come here, you won't have to order, the books will be ready. I appreciate that. One of my asylum seeker friends talks about how, jail, and he's Iranian, and he said, in Iran, jail is awful. I've seen people tortured. Hong Kong jail is a 5-star hotel. You can choose what diet you want, whether you want Western or Chinese or halal. Wow, what a great place. Now, he's exaggerating. I've never been in jail in my life, but nonetheless, I can count on a certain degree of civility even now. After all, even in the protests in 2019, no protester was directly killed by police that we know of. And that's really important to remember. It remains a civil society. And I mean, I've been talking a lot to media about this because I was visible in the protests. This goes into China. I think at this point I would be afraid to go into China because I think I might well be taken in, especially given the new Cold War emergence. I don't know. There's supposed to be a meeting there in November that I have said I would go to. I've got to think about whether to do this, but I may well not. My Guangzhou book, I did something strange there. I never was linked to any university. And I also went undercover. I was going as a tourist. Now, this may, I mean, the person asking about ethics, Jeff, you may look askance at this too, but I talked to my graduate student, a young, somewhat attractive married woman, and I said, look, if they ask me why I'm coming into Guangzhou every week, let's have this fiction. I'm coming in to see you because we're having an affair, okay? And she said, fine, I understand that completely. So that was going to be the fiction in case I was taken in. But it's interesting that the immigration authorities never knew who I was. They never had any idea. And this went so far that, I mean, my picture during the protests of 2014 was in Apple Daily, the leading newspaper in Hong Kong. And I mean, I was right there in the newspaper. They never saw it. I felt kind of hurt by this. Don't you know who I am? See, here's my picture in the paper. You know, fortunately, nobody ever saw it. And I always got through with no problem. I never let anybody know. And when I was walking with my African friends, and they would often be stopped because many of them were immigration overstayers. And they would be stopped and taken away and locked off in jail. In Chinese jails, I've known people who've died there. You know, they're not good places to be in. And I would simply pull out my passport and show it to them. And they'd look at me and say, oh, so you're an English teacher from Hong Kong. Oh, welcome to Guangzhou. Now, this is racist, no doubt about it. As a white person, I am treated absolutely better than blacks would be. My African friends never let me forget about this. I mean, this is absolutely true. But it did mean that the authorities never pieced together what I was doing, which is remarkable to me because, come on, there aren't very many elderly white men going into the African district of Guangzhou doing what I was doing, often with a tape recorder in front of me, but I was never stopped. So it's interesting. I am convinced that a lot of authority in China is much less homogenous than we like to think. You know, it's much more different agencies working in different directions. I know we all worry now about the surveillance world of China that's watching 100% of people, but I just finished just today a paper on anthropology in mainland China, interviewing a number of mainland anthropologists. And there too, nobody really knows what the rules are. And different municipalities, different universities, different regions have different rules altogether as to what you can say in the classroom. So it is a little bit more haphazard than we tend to think about. Now, how did my book get canceled? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened with that. But I know one of my colleagues has had every one of his books canceled that way. And he's not particularly anti-China. Who can say? Maybe whether it's a low-level bureaucrat or somebody higher level, we have no way of knowing. But I haven't worried about authorities that much. And even now, I don't. For example, a lot of my friends in Hong Kong are beginning to use encrypted software for their emails and so on. I'm not going to. I'm going to be completely transparent in everything I say. And I think that's just a general principle. I think I am saying things that are perfectly legitimate to say. And I shouldn't get in trouble for this. That's my own view. Am I being naive? We'll see.
Lydia, do you still have a couple of questions? I think you said you had a number of questions.
Oh no, I just had one, but I know
Sorry.
Lydia and Lillian is so similar.
I'm sorry, Lydia.
But I was just gonna say thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting because I think with doing research in authoritarian states in the Arab world, having something translated into Arabic would be very threatening. So it's okay if you're writing on this in English. We understand this is for your academic career, as long as you're not doing anything that would be more generally accessible and could be threatening. But yeah, it sounds like the context is quite different. I was just thinking about the kind of greater repression on kind of democratic activism in Hong Kong. I was just wondering recently if that was affecting the academic sphere. So
Well,
that's a very interesting response. Thank you.
Two quick points here, Lily, and you're absolutely right. I just had a student come back from Pakistan, and she was telling me how she was robbed at gunpoint by police. You know, that's the kind of thing that can go on there. And she's now in China, and I was talking to her about China, and she said, look, you just have to have basic anthropological knowledge of how you should behave anywhere you go to, which obviously she was able to do in Pakistan. She is a speaker of Pashto and Urdu. I mean, she's able to get by okay, but you're absolutely right. And in Jordan, I mean, you know the local layout of the land, back to local knowledge here, you know what you can do and what you can't. And I think I did too. I think I was pretty well aware of the layout of the land in both places, enough to not get in trouble. Now, the alternative explanation, which is also true, is I've just been very lucky, but that is quite true. Now, what about Hong Kong today? That's a really interesting issue. And the issue is whether the Chinese Communist Party will be content with simply ending democracy in Hong Kong, or whether they are going to move on and stifle all free expression. I have been in probably half a dozen Chinese language newspapers and magazines over the last couple of weeks because of what I wrote on Facebook, that I'm extending my contract. That simple matter caused me to become a minor celebrity here, which is bizarre. And they were saying to me, oh, wow, you're willing to keep using critical thinking in Hong Kong. And I say, look, you're in at least as much danger as I am because you're writing about this. I'm only talking in a classroom. So you see where this goes. We're all gambling that we're going to be okay. To me, that's a gamble worth taking because in my heart of hearts, I am not willing to go to jail for democracy. And I gave a talk actually at the Umbrella Movement in the little university they had there about how don't put all your hopes in democracy because you can elect bad leaders. That was before Donald Trump, but look at Donald Trump. I'd far rather have Xi Jinping as my leader than Donald Trump. Now, that's only my own personal view, but nonetheless, I mean, democracy isn't the cure that many people are saying. And I know many Democratic Party activists. A very good friend of mine was taken in, and I just was speaking to him a couple days ago about what happened to him. He was released. He was not charged in the end, but still. We just don't know what's going to happen and how much this is going to move on. Just today in the newspaper, I read one top pro-establishment figure saying, China is going to stop with ending the Democratic Party. They're not going to move on and end free expression because they wouldn't have anything to gain from it. And they'd have a lot more to lose. Maybe. On the other hand, maybe not. We'll see what may come. And you know, Lillian, I'm dealing with this every day. A mainland student just 2 hours ago, actually, I was writing this when I heard from Mathews, you should be coming now, was asking me, hey, can I still come to Hong Kong? I was going to enter your MA program, and I've heard about what's happening to Hong Kong. Is it still safe? Can I come and learn? And I said, yes, our classes are the same as they were 5 years ago. But I said, they might conceivably change. I don't think they will. So it's all a gamble. To me, critical thinking is a gamble worth taking. I believe strongly in critical thinking as taught in the classroom. So that in the class I taught last fall, for example, on Hong Kong, I said, Hong Kong has been a city of protest over the last 10 years. Explain these protests from multiple points of view. Now, what I wanted was, yes, you can explain from protesters' point of view. What does the mainland think? Put in their point of view too. And then from all of those points of view, derive your own opinion, that's fine. But show that you understand what a variety of different players would think. That mainlanders would think Hong Kongers are spoiled rotten. Fine, that has to be understood. So it seems to me that's a point of view worth taking. And, you know, China itself understands that. Remember, Xi Jinping's own daughter went to Harvard. You know, China does let massive numbers of its intellectual young people go to universities abroad, including definitely in Hong Kong. They know this. They're not stupid. They know how the system works. I think, and they realize that they need a safety valve for critical thinking. China doesn't trust most of its citizens, but I think it does trust maybe the top 10% to be able to learn a degree of critical thinking and come back and still defend China. That's, I think, the calculation they're making. And I hope that continues. We'll see.
Okay, Lydia, back to you.
No, I mean, like I think my second question relates a bit, like still on about like interaction with research participants. Also, given that like these research participants may also be the audience of, let's say, the academic work I'm producing. And I mean a bit the question also, how do I do if like my research, or like the ways of dealing in cases where my research participants also by themselves conduct research work. So for example, I don't know, like, of course I rely on a lot of informants for, let's say, getting interviews planned, like on personal contact of my research participants. They help me with translation work sometimes. They provide me with, I don't know, a lot of, yeah, actually they do a lot of research work for me. So like this is also a question I have also. And I mean, also in the sense of, I'm very interested also in participatory tools. So how like also let my research participants really actively participate in my research. And I mean, I'm still like in the beginning of my research, so I'm still also unsure how I can really, let's say, implement this. But yeah, I don't know, I would be interested to hear, let's say, your experience, your perspective on this point.
That's a good question. My research interviewees never really conducted research for me. A couple of asylum seekers wanted to, but they just didn't have the ability to do it for a lot of reasons. Partly because they might have had a lower level of education back home, and so it was just hard for them to understand what was going on, really, what's required, really. A couple of people did actually more informally, but I know in anthropology there is a call to have your interviewees serve as co-authors for your books and so on. And I would certainly be sympathetic to that in a lot of different occasions, but I haven't done that. What I have done in my own recent book on Guangzhou is to have my graduate students be co-authors of the book, which I think is good to do. Rather than hire them, I'd rather have them be co-authors, and I'm happy I did that because they could interview people I couldn't interview. But as for interviewees, the gap in understanding what I was after was so great that never really was a temptation, except in the case of one guy. My great friend Ali, who I still teach him every Saturday in my class for asylum seekers. He's not an asylum seeker. He is a Somali businessman who is bored silly by business. So he'd love to be an academic. And he is absolutely terrific. I've given a number of presentations with him to American business people and so on. But when I try to compensate him, he just laughs at me and says, I already have so much more money than you have that there's no reason in the world for you to give me any money. And that's quite true. I thought of co-authoring with him. He is not very interested. This wouldn't benefit him at all. So I guess I am working closely with somebody like him as a key informant. And that really is good to do, but it wouldn't really fit the other people I know of. And it's not that I haven't thought about this. I certainly do want to help in this way, but it's not been something that realistically would have been plausible under these circumstances. So I guess that's my answer to that. Now, if you do have some well-educated, and I don't mean to stress education because that's very elitist, but unfortunately to do academic writing, you need to be somewhat well-educated. People who are wanting to speak out for themselves, yeah, definitely do this. One thing I have done is proofread about 6 books that asylum seekers I know have written. And I sure didn't want my name on it because it was often rather silly stuff, but I'm certainly willing to proofread it and make sure it looks as good as possible. Several of my former students have books out on Amazon.com that they self-published. Great. I was embarrassed the other week to find out one of my students has said he's written a book and put my name on it. How Police Hurt Society. I'm not sure I want my name on that book, but he's an asylum seeker who has placed my name on the book as well as his, as the co-author for him. I'm not going to write him and tell him not to do it. I'm going to ignore it, I think. But this kind of thing can come out. But the more basic issue you're talking about is one of anthropologists who are indeed urged to co-author books with their interviewees. And I've certainly thought about it in a number of contexts. I've given talks with a number of asylum seekers. I do that frequently, but writing a book would be a different matter because somebody has to be responsible for the narrative voice. And that's one thing I'm good at. I often tell my students I'm not very smart, but I know how to write. And I know that better than my interviewees often. So that's how I justify this.
Okay, Lydia, do you have any more questions? Sorry, I thought you mentioned you have a few questions. I take it as a no. Okay, any other questions? I have a couple myself, so maybe it's time for me now.
For you, Marty, it's a question for you. I notice you have 3 lurkers in the class. Someone called Camera, and then Alcina and Joseph. When I do that in my class, I say, show me your face or you're not allowed to talk. Oh, Joseph, I know you. You asked the question earlier. I got you. You're on. But what do you do when that happens? Is that people's right, or do you urge them to show their faces? What do you do?
Well, basically, I mean, because we are recording this this session and we're going to put on, so basically I said to people like, look, if you don't want to be recorded, if you don't want your face to be recorded and then published and then put on YouTube later on, just don't switch your camera. Oh yes, there's Alsana here as well. And
sorry, I embarrassed you with showing your face. I apologize.
And the camera person.
Marty, you say this goes back to Lillian's question, because Lillian was asking about how publicity a bit for these people. I do record all my classes because I've got numbers of students in places like Chile and so on, and in Ukraine, all over the world, who wouldn't be able to participate otherwise. Now, I would insist people show their faces, and I just say, be cautious in what you ask about. Is that a violation of people's rights? No, because they don't have to, and some people still insist they don't. But participation does factor in grades. And a couple of people over the years, over the last year, have indeed participated being not showing their face. But the problem I always have is if I don't show my face, I'm spending my time on the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Facebook. I'm not paying attention. I was at a lecture this afternoon, and God, don't tell anybody this. This is being recorded, but the lecture was boring. And so as a result, what I did was read the newspaper. And then I figured out one question I had to ask. As a teacher, I've got to ask a question. But I read the newspaper. How many of my students are the same to me? God, this guy's boring. I'm going to do something else. Facebook is more interesting. I'm sure that happened. Sorry, camera, whoever you are, you're not doing that, I'm sure. But anyway, you get the idea. Okay, sorry.
Well, the mystery of camera person is actually another laptop that is recording this conversation, so we don't have to do it. So,
sorry to insult you, camera. Then nothing personal. Okay.
But going back to my questions, I mean, I have a couple, slightly different ones. I mean, building on what you just said about participants and relationships. I mean, I wonder, because you also earlier talked about, the distinction between friends and participants, and I'm wondering, like, how do you distinguish that, and also how do you distinguish like the key participants? So who are the key participants? Who are participants? Who are your friends? Is it all just like a mix, or is there a hierarchy there being put up, or how do you operationalize this?
Well, I don't really need to operationalize it. It's just a matter of course. Who wants to talk to me most? There's some people who would be hi, and that's all. And those people are participants because I might occasionally ask them something. Other people, I mean, the best example from my book was a Pakistani phone dealer. And I was asking him about phones so much, he just said, look, this is silly. If you're asking so many questions about phones, come behind the counter. You can work with me. And every time you come here, come to the counter and work with me. He was engaged in selling copy phones. I really was happy to do this. I learned a lot from him. He taught me everything I knew for 2 months. Terrific. So, I mean, he became a key informant just because he was willing to put himself in that position. So a lot of it is just how people are. And, Mathews, it's no different from your friends. When I think about my friends, I don't normally categorize people into acquaintances, friends, best friends forever. I don't think about that much. But if I sat down and did it, yeah, I'd be able to figure it out. And the same is true with key informants versus ordinary informants versus informants who are also friends. I mean, all of this it plays in a situation, but I don't formalize it and think about it much. It's also true that some people who told me really deep things, I only saw once. I mean, I'll never forget one asylum seeker late at night in Chungking Mansions. He and I were drinking whiskey together, and he was talking about his dead brother who had gone into the army, and he didn't. He'd fled instead. And he began sobbing to me, insisting on recording everything, telling his whole story. I never saw him again after this. I have no idea what happened, but that was, one of the most moving, eloquent experiences I've ever had in my life. So often you don't know how much these things will stand out. Part of it too is how much people are telling the truth and how much they're lying. There certainly are some people who are always lying. Fine, let it be. I mean, I'm not going to call them out on it. Just, okay, come on, I know the game here. And other people will be remarkably honest. It's the latter who I'm going to talk to. And I will do various kinds of ways of trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not. It's not that hard to find out. I mean, if you have a number of different people you can talk to, you can figure it out. But all that too is a part of who I would rely on more and who I would rely on less. Often the people I talk to most are my very good friends. For example, this guy who I was behind the counter of his phone stall. I have known him for the last 15 years now, or 12 or 13 years. And Joseph has a message. Okay, well, thanks, Joseph. I'm glad you were here. See you later. And back to the question, though, to Mathews here is, I've known him for 15 years now. And I just got a phone call several months ago. He's in Pakistan and he wants me to go back to his to Pakistan because he's getting married. And wow, I'd love to go to his wedding. I'm afraid to because of COVID-19. I can't go. But that's really interesting that we have that degree of friendship. So he is my friend. He's also my informant. He doesn't make a distinction between these two, and I don't make a distinction either.
Yeah, okay. Susanna?
Yeah, I want to come in here. Actually, it's a good moment, I think, to ask. The question I've been thinking about since I read the piece is when you talk about your occasional infusions of cash and instances where you've made payments of small or big amounts of money to various people in various different situations. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how this has impacted specific relationships that you've had and how much you've thought about this before, or whether it's often been something that you've done in the moment because you felt compelled kind of as a human to human action to help somebody out, or whether it's something that also as part of this bigger research process that you always think through in a very, very careful way. Because I can imagine that it's sometimes not very easy to know what the right thing to do if there isn't even a right thing.
Well, it hasn't been an issue. And to my great surprise, Susanna, I have never been abused. Let me take that back. The one time I've been abused was not over my giving money to somebody. It's over a guy I met who was doing business in Chungking Mansions from a European country, actually. And I visited him in that European country and stayed with him for a week and felt very grateful. And then he asked me to go into business with me, but it was clear it was just a business proposition. So I gave, I think 20,000 US dollars, a rather large sum of money, and I never saw it again. But that was more a matter of being cheated. I mean, there was no question, or maybe just as being stupid, because I learned later that he was rather stupid. He didn't realize that you couldn't bring in four-wheel drive trucks from Malaysia and send them into this country where temperatures were below freezing. The gas tanks would burst. He didn't know that. So that's what happened, apparently. But in any case, fine. I mean, that was a different matter. In terms of giving money, though, to people who need it, it's amazing, or people who say they need it, it's amazing how I have never been abused, to my knowledge. Asylum seekers do need money. And again, I know these guys for many years now. And I'm quite confident that when they're asking me for money, they really need it. I mean, I'm about the third line of people they ask. There are NGOs around. There are various other people they can ask. They can ask their landlord for a stay on the rent. But when they really need it, they do, and I pay. And people are very good about not asking too much. When they do ask for too much, like some guy just six months ago, he'd asked me for 2,500 Hong Kong dollars, or about 500 US dollars for a new computer. Then the next month he wanted help in his rent. And I'm saying, well, look, okay, I'll help you out with the rent, but don't ask me for a while, because I can't be seen to favor you and not other people. Generally, I'm paying about US $500. That's probably too much. Maybe US $6,000 a year total for my various asylum seeker friends I know. And that's because these guys are only getting about US $400 a month in subsidies, and you'll starve on that. They can't, some may live off their girlfriends, there's various other things, but I have really been aided in this. And I know this for sure, actually, because we are in the midst of, I mean, earlier Jeff mentioned the ethics board at your university. Here in Hong Kong, we have research assessment exercises, which are quite disgusting. You may go through the same thing. But one element now they're looking at is impact. And so somebody in my department has to go around asking NGOs where my impact is. And this guy has had to interview asylum seekers. And apparently they're all saying, thank you to Gordon so much. He's helped us so much. I'm deeply embarrassed by this. But he's telling him it's embarrassing to him. So, I mean, apparently I'm really, really, really appreciated. And I feel very great about that. I'm not being used as far as I can tell. I tend to be a little more soft-hearted than not, but partly because I am ridiculously highly paid. I may be, I mean, for all I know, I'm the highest paid anthropologist in the world right now. I don't know. Salaries are insanely high in Hong Kong for academics. And partly it's because the way Hong Kong works is that a business professor or a doctor gets the same wage that I get if they're at my level of promotion. And so as a result, you know, it's not that anthropologists don't count, political scientists don't count. Instead, no, we're all at the same wage level. And so it means there's a lot of money getting paid to. I don't know what to do with all this money. I mean, I don't have any material desires really, particularly. So what do I do? You know, oh, I have one funny story I've got to tell you, Susanna. My wife uses money to give to elephants. My wife, who is rather short in stature, she's Japanese, loves elephants. And she gives money to a wildlife foundation in Kenya. And the asylum seekers I teach heard about that. So they invited her to class one day. And they're very polite people, but one asked her, I understand you give a lot of money to elephants, but don't you think that we human beings are worth more than elephants? And then my wife said, actually, no. I think elephants are worth more than human beings because there's a lot of human beings, but there aren't very many elephants left. And they were deeply amused by that, fortunately, but that was a very interesting conversation. I've known these guys a long time, and this was done with a sense of humor. But the long answer to your question is that, the short answer to your question is that, I've given a long answer, money could have been a great problem, and it never has been. And I think it's because of the innate common sense that I've had in how I do this. But your questions and Jeff's questions and a number of your other questions are making me articulate that which I never have fully articulated. I guess I've articulated a little bit, like in the book and in some articles, but not very much. And I keep wondering, am I rather wise or am I quite lucky? I suspect it's the latter more than the former, but these things haven't come back to bite, and I seem to have won gratitude from people for it, which makes me feel rather happy, with just a couple of exceptions, one of which I described to you earlier, that guy whose brother got killed and so on.
Cool, okay. I actually have one more unrelated to this question. I wanted to ask you, Gordon, because you talk about you have talked a little bit about the importance of a recorder and walking around with a recorder and giving away your business cards. But I'm wondering, and the importance of notes in writing and recording notes. But do you code? Do you do coding? And if so, do you have any tips on how to plan and conduct coding and do themes and codes and
Okay, all of this is personal only. I mean, each different researcher will have their own way of doing things. Certainly more in political science or sociology, coding seems to be emphasized more. I don't do that. And I also don't ever take notes. I'd much rather record. I want to keep my hands free. And one reason for that is I have the sense that when I'm talking to informants, I want to be as fully human as I can. And that means using my hands to talk with them, emphasize things, just really be with them. Don't ever think about something else. If I were to be writing down, my face would be down. I would appear to be much less close to them. But every time I talk to somebody as an interviewee, I want to be there for them. I really care about what they're saying, and I want to be there for what they're saying. So the recorder enables me to do that. Now coding, I could do it, and certainly the idea of cutting and pasting was a royal pain. I mean, 3 months of doing that was not very pleasant to do, but it did enable me to shape my narrative structure rather easily. I understood what was where, and I could put it together. Another thing, Mathews, you didn't ask about, I've never hired anybody to transcribe tapes. I do it all myself so that I can know what's in them. All of these take a little bit more labor, but to me, they seem to work best. Coding might work pretty well if you've got a huge amount of data and an article of 30 pages that you need to work on. I mean, there may be situations where coding would make perfect sense. But my interviews generally are so personally conducted. And also because I'm looking at how people talk as much as what they say, it's important just to have the narrative flow. I mean, look at the Chungking Mansions book. When you see personal accounts of people, you can see what they sound like. You can see the stories they're telling. That's key, rather than the particular topic being used. So this may be a disciplinary difference in part, but for me as an anthropologist, it seems to work better this way. I've never felt a need for coding. Now, I'm certainly not a Luddite, and I use computers quite a bit, but that's an area that I wouldn't see a necessity for.
Okay, cool. All right, well, anyone has any more questions? Any more questions around? If not, I think we can slowly wrap up. Oh, Wolfgang.
I mean, okay, maybe a final question. I was wondering, because you said you used a lot of research assistants, you worked together with a lot of research assistants over the years. So yeah, I was kind of just wondering, how did you, because it sounded a little bit like they would do their work independently of you. It sounded a little bit in the book. So I was wondering whether you, how did you introduce your research assistants to the field, and yeah, kind of how did you work together there? I was just a little curious.
Okay, it depends on the different place we're in. In Guangzhou, I went along with my two co-authors, and I was generally with them. And that was a whole different experience than in Chungking Mansions. In Guangzhou, I was with them because, a lot of the time anyway, because if they would see me alone, they wouldn't know what to make of me. If they would see the particular woman I work with most closely, Lanessa, alone, they wouldn't know what to make of her. But if the two of us are talking, first of all, here is a young Chinese woman and an older white man speaking in English. This was a major draw. We would draw a big audience sometimes. And I remember one of my best interviewees was a guy who said, wow, I haven't heard English being spoken so long, so well. Let me be a chapter in your book. I mean, that's really cool. That makes life very easy for me. That was research done much more collectively. And working with Lanessa was splendid because she was able to know so much and bring so much to this. It's also true that it was very funny. Gender plays a role in here. The African guys would all talk to her about how much they wanted to have a girlfriend and their romantic encounters. They'd talk to me about business. I couldn't have found out about romance from them. She couldn't have found out about business from them. No, it was both of us who worked together this way, which was quite wonderful how it worked out. Now, Chungking Mansions was a little bit different because there were some specific areas that I didn't recognize, that I was not recognized and able to talk to. Sex workers was a good example. You know, it's hard for me to talk to sex workers because they're going to look at me as a customer. You know, and I'll never forget one somewhat older Indian sex worker, and I was trying to figure out what's going on because she invited me for an interview, and she said, Mister, I never do this business, but for you, it's going to be at least 1,500 a night. You know, so clearly that's the kind of contradiction we see going on here. 1,500 Hong Kong dollars, or roughly 200 Western, which is interesting. I did get a female student, though, who was willing to do it, and she found out stuff I couldn't find. I also had a male student who was able to find out a great deal about heroin addicts. He had taken heroin himself. He knew that world better than I did, and I certainly cautioned him, do not ever get involved in this stuff, but he was able to find out quite a bit. So different people could. Now, I didn't recruit research assistants. As a rule, they came to me. They said, look, and this is maybe unique to Hong Kong, where people want to help. This is why I love Hong Kong so much. And this is the only thing, but the sheer desire of students to help is extraordinary. Students will come up and say, God, I'd love to be a research assistant. Yes, I'll pay them. But no, it's not that. They want to do this. They want some desire to help. Tomorrow, by the way, I have to meet a 17-year-old woman here, a girl coming in, and she wants to be a research assistant. Can I find anything she can help with? I'm not sure, but this happens a lot. People just wanting to do this for experience, really. And this happened a lot in the Chungking Mansions book, and I was able to help several of them out because I actually had them travel. Lanessa went to Ghana. Another guy, Jose, went to Nigeria. Another person went to Kenya. Maggie went to Kenya. Great, they could go, and I trust them. These are either, they weren't undergraduates, they were all MA or MPhil students by then. So I knew that they had a certain amount of smarts, and I needed to make sure, do you have street smarts? You probably saw in the writing, Wolfgang, how I did have some problem with some of the females who volunteered to do it, you know, in terms of them being sexually harassed in some ways. I warned them very vigorously, but above all, they're the ones who came and asked me. I teach, by the way, Introduction to Anthropology, and my teaching assistant told students, look for the sexual harassment in this book. Was the professor being ethical? Was I being ethical? I think I was, because they were asking. I mean, when somebody comes up and says, look, I really want to do this. Are you sure you want to think about it? You might get sexually harassed. No, I want to do this. Well, yes, I'm going to say yes. And I warned them rather vigorously. Now, in no cases was anybody assaulted or suffered very much. It was a matter of an unwanted kiss in one case, and unwanted text messages in another. Those aren't good, but it's obviously not the same as a really dangerous matter that one could think about. I'm not happy about it, but both of these women remain my friends, and they also continue to be research assistants without necessarily going to Chungking Mansions. And I had warned them about this so many times, but what can I say? The most interesting case of that, I think you read about, but it was where one of my female students, and she was an undergraduate, but she was very bright. She asked to go to Chungking Mansions, and she had spoken to a Pakistani guy, and then after they had talked, she shook his hand. I had warned her, don't shake the hands of these guys. You know, they've probably, if they're not married, they might never have touched a woman's hand before. Don't do this. She did anyway, and then instantly it began. I love you. I can't live without you. Please, I love you. And this just went on for several weeks. Well, what can I say about that? It's not as if I didn't warn her, but this is the kind of thing that happened a bit. I don't think I could have been more gender sensitive here. I think I'm doing everything that I could have. But if any of you thinks I could have done more, let me know. Well, you haven't said anything, so I won't pull anything out of your mouths, but still.
You can also write in the chat privately if you...
Sure.
No, but seriously now, I don't know if are there any more questions? Because if not, I think we can wrap up. In that case, no, it's almost 3 o'clock CET Florence time. So Gordon, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for the presentation and answering all the questions that we've had today. And to everybody else, thank you very much for coming. And hopefully see you next week during Wolfgang's presentation, or in I think it was 3 or 4 weeks when we have another Qualify session like this one, or doing our ethnography book club next month. See you there. See you around.
Okay, see you later.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Gordon.
you.